At the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue and here at the Tech Diplomacy Academy, we focus often on trusted technology and building a global trusted tech network of allies and partners in business and in government and across civil society so that we're working together in what is a very contested geopolitical and technology environment. And so often that conversation focuses on the United States and it focuses on China. But today we are going to be talking about Latin America. Now, why are we talking about Latin America when it comes to the future of technology and the future of a global trusted tech network? Well, it's important because of the proximity to the United States and the role of Latin America and all the countries in the region as critical partners in the Western Hemisphere. It's important because of the fact that with a few exceptions, democracy prevails across the region. So it's a critical partner in the allied world. And that in the context of nearshoring and in friendshoring, our critical supply chains, it doesn't really get much nearer than Latin America. And so we're going to be talking about how important it is, especially as our adversaries like the Chinese government are very focused on deepening commercial ties, economic ties, and diplomatic ties in the region, and what that means for governments, for businesses in U.S. and allied countries. And so very excited to have with us today at the Tech Diplomacy Academy, Eric Farnsworth, who is the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. It is the premier international business organization of leading international companies across all sectors, really, that are very focused on a commitment to economic and social development, open markets, the rule of law, and democracy throughout the Western Hemisphere. So he's one of the foremost experts that is going to give us insight into tech diplomacy and Latin America and what the future holds when it comes to emerging technology. So Eric, thank you very much for being here at the Tech Diplomacy Academy.
Thanks for the invitation, Michelle. It's great to join you.
So I'm going to start with an article that you recently penned in Barron's. And it's a great article. It's called "In an Insecure World, Americans Should Look South." And you actually say that Americans don't normally think of artificial intelligence and other sophisticated technologies when they think of Latin America, but that increasingly they should. Costa Rica is becoming a hub for semiconductors. The Dominican Republic becoming a biotech manufacturing hub. Brazil, a fintech leader. There's a number of unicorns now, 26, I think was the latest, across the region. And you say that the hemisphere is ripe for reassessment because of emerging technology. Why now?
Yeah, thanks very much. When most folks from North America or the United States think about Latin America and the Caribbean, they think about generally the negative side of the ledger, whether it's crime or illegal migration or sometimes, authoritarian governance like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc. But my argument is that although those issues exist and they are true, there's a whole other side of the ledger that people are missing. And that's the opportunity side. And, the one thing that we saw, if we learned anything coming out of the pandemic, which was worldwide, but that the United States was overly dependent on many of our supply chains for certain products with Asia. In a national crisis, a security crisis, a pandemic, something else, if we don't have access to those types of goods, then our own economy suffers and our people suffer. And so if you take that and you couple it with the opportunities that exist in the Western Hemisphere, in our own shared hemisphere, I believe that it really does provide a moment to think about how can we look to Western Hemisphere, Latin America and the Caribbean, really to help us do better by ourselves by increasing some of those supply chains for very important goods like semiconductors, like high technology, like pharmaceutical products, et cetera. So that's the basis of the argument. Particularly as things continue, unfortunately, to heat up in the South China Sea and with some of the tensions that we see there. So I really think there's a geostrategic moment here that we really need to take note of.
So when you talk about this opportunity that exists now with Latin America, and especially because of the rise of emerging technologies and because of the fact that so many countries in Latin America allied with us democratically, why do you think until now it's been somewhat overlooked? I think there's an ongoing narrative about how the United States in particular hasn't paid enough attention to the region for decades, really. why has it been overlooked, or why is there at least a perception it's been overlooked diplomatically, or even from a business perspective? You work with so many business leaders in the region. Whatever the challenges?
It's a critical question. I've spent 35 years of my career trying to answer exactly that question. And there are two main reasons, I think. From the economic side, it's really size of market. If you're a business person and you're looking to sell stuff or manufacture stuff, you're going to go where the markets are largest, where you can produce at the best rate of return, where their population's willing to, consume your products, et cetera. And that tends to take people toward Europe and Asia. And so those are the markets that have developed most economically from a business perspective. Latin America, we frequently have the statistic where we say almost 40% of, U.S. trade is with the Western Hemisphere. That's true, but it also includes Canada and Mexico. If you look at Latin America as a whole, it's a smaller percentage than that. So that's one, is size of market and the ability of countries really to be integrated among themselves to create a larger marketplace as they've done, for example, in Europe with the EU, or in Asia with some of their manifestations of those types of activities as well. I think the second is really based on national security. I mean, there are no nuclear weapons in the Western Hemisphere outside the United States, and that's a good thing. There aren't religious conflicts in the Western Hemisphere, and that's a good thing. And we don't have state-on-state violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's a good thing. I mean, yes, we have drug cartels. Yes, we have crime and violence. But we don't have the same type of security challenges that we have in the Middle East or in Asia, South China Sea, or in Ukraine, or what have you. And so my contention, again, is the attention goes where the conflicts and the problems are. I get that. But if you're looking for opportunities and security of supply chains, you have to look at places where conflict is actually reduced. And that takes me once again to the Western Hemisphere. So, look, I think it's, I would turn it around and say the absence of these types of things is actually a net positive for the Western Hemisphere. That doesn't mean that this is an idyllic situation, that there aren't things that the region itself has to do better at, and we can get into some of those things. From the broader perspective, I think that it probably explains a little bit, at least, of what you're asking.
Do you think there's going to be a change? So you mentioned size of market as one stumbling block so far in terms of diplomatic attention or business attention in Latin America. There was one recent report about venture capital investment in the region, and there was actually a rapid amount of VC development in Latin America in 2021. This is right after the pandemic. There was about $16 billion worth of venture capital deals, 950 deals. It was about 3 to 4 times what it was before the pandemic. It's now come back down to pre-pandemic levels. So we're seeing about $4 billion worth of investment, 700 to 800 deals. But what are you hearing from, let's say, the VC community, especially as Latin America starts to make a concerted effort? Like you mentioned in your article, Costa Rica on semiconductors, the Dominican Republic on biotech, all of the fintech leadership in Brazil. Like, do you see that as a catalyst really for drawing more venture capital investment, more private sector investment in the region?
Yeah, I certainly do, but it's country specific and it's sector specific. So you've mentioned Costa Rica. I think that's a great example. Costa Rica is a relatively small country. And so why would semiconductor investment go toward Costa Rica? Well, the answer is because they received a very large anchor investment 25 years ago that created microchips and manufactured them and built an entire ecosystem around it to create the jobs, including the high performing jobs, engineers and managers needed to operate in a very sophisticated environment that many of the other countries in the region, or indeed worldwide, simply haven't developed those types of ecosystems. And what did the government of Costa Rica do to get that anchor investment? I mean, I was at the State Department at the time, and the issue was, the government had to play the game, not just to, the right tax incentives and the right, levels of education for folks who could, really staff out the jobs and be part of the manufacturing processes. But they had to do things like dedicate electricity and portions of the power grid so that the plant could run with, uninterrupted power. You have to remember in Latin America in the 1990s, the ability to get power uninterrupted was a major thing. Well, it still is in some parts of the region. So governments have a very important role to play. They have to create the conditions that the investment will then come toward. But once you get that anchor investment, once you get that building out and understanding of the proper role of the private sector as well as governments in the region, then they start to build on each other. And so Costa Rica has done that. And under the current government, they've really tried to make this a broader part of their national economic development. I mean, look, most people, when they think of Costa Rica, let's be honest, they think about, tourism, they think about, vacations they might have taken. And all of that is very, very important. In fact, Costa Rica itself tried to define itself as an ecotourism destination and has for the last generation. But what we're seeing is that only takes you so far. You can only handle so many tourists per year. You can only, accommodate so many things before, you stop to grow. You stop growing. You need to have alternatives. And this is clearly one of them. So that's a great example. There are others, but that's a very good one in the current environment.
So you mentioned Costa Rica, Eric, and I want to deep dive into that. You were in country with Commerce Secretary Raimondo, with Purdue President Meng Chang earlier this year, when Costa Rica announced this new semiconductor investment roadmap and really raising their hand and making a deliberate effort to become a semiconductor hub in Latin America. Because the United States and so many of our allies are focused on nearshoring and friendshoring, Costa Rica, the whole region, is very ripe for being a critical partner in this. Purdue University announced a 3-point plan to help Costa Rica when it comes to semiconductor partnership and education, making the university semiconductor degrees program available, making Spanish versions of Purdue University online curriculum in microelectronics, and then partnering with the College of Engineering on research and innovation in chip design and packaging. But I want to hear from your perspective, what was your message to Costa Rica when you were down there representing the Council of the Americas, and what were you seeing and hearing in terms of some of the big opportunities and challenges for Costa Rica in becoming a critical semiconductor hub in the region?
I heard a lot of excitement. I heard a lot of anticipation. And my message was, yes, that's true, but that's just the beginning. You're going to have to work for this. And, you already have the basic infrastructure in place, but this is not something that just is going to happen on its own. It really has to be a national priority. And I think that message was very well received. And let me give you a couple of specific ideas. I mean, you mentioned the partnership with Purdue. I think that's critical. Look, the Achilles heel of Latin America for years has been education. The folks with access to money or the elites, I mean, they're going to educate their kids. They'll get world-class education, generally not in the countries necessarily they're from, but they'll get world-class education. It's the broader populations where education has really been a problem. And if you are trying to define your country or a portion of your country as a worthy receptor of high technology investment, you need well-trained, highly educated people. So that is a basic input for attracting some of the investment that we've seen come to the region, but also more that could be. Costa Rica abolished its army back in the 1940s, and much of that money that they would have spent toward national defense has gone into the educational system. It hasn't been perfect, but they have clearly prioritized education. They need to do more. They can do more. I think they're willing to do more. But that's one specific idea that it's a long-term play. It's a long-term commitment. You have to say we're going to educate our citizens. Not all of those folks will end up, working for a high technology provider, but by educating your people, you will open the doors to greater entrepreneurship. You will open the doors to greater equality, at the macro and micro levels both. You will open the doors to greater opportunity in whatever sector they choose to concentrate. So I think that's a key. A second key is clearly infrastructure. I mean, you have to have appropriate infrastructure, both to produce, to manufacture, and also then to get manufactured products to market. And I think the other major piece that I talked to the Costa Ricans about when I was there was clearly the regulatory environment. Look, businesses in the Western tradition, governments don't tell businesses where to invest. Investors will go where they believe they can do the best. And so the conditions have to be appropriate for them to even consider it. And, a very small country like Costa Rica, in terms of geographic size and in terms of population, is competing for the same pool of investment as countries like China or Japan or Canada or Brazil or other countries. And so what's going to be a country like Costa Rica make a country like that stand out to attract the type of investment that the government and the business community and the folks are looking for? Well, you have to do things that will cause folks to take notice of you. And I think that message is very well received. Again, it's a long-term thing. It has to be sustained government to government. It can't be political. A new government comes in, changes focus, all of these things. Well, then you lose the momentum. You lose the interest. Investors are looking for long-term stability. They've got to find it. Costa Rica, a long-standing democracy, provides it. So again, it's one example. There are others, but these are some of the messages I was presenting. And as I say, by and large, I thought it was pretty well received.
You make such a good point about the critical nature of infrastructure and the critical nature of the regulatory environment. One of the things that we talked about when I was at the summit that the Council of the Americas hosted, the Washington Summit that you hosted, was the importance of trusted technology, and that the future for Latin America isn't just about any technology or being good at technology in general. It's about trusted technology, because to your point, they're competing for private sector investment from the U.S. and many of our allied countries, from Europe, the same thing from a government perspective. And so when you're competing, trust is really a competitive advantage. Businesses want to know that their capital is going somewhere where there is data security, where there is the rule of law, where there's transparency, where there's reciprocity, respect for human rights. And so all of that is really important to attracting capital. And so speaking of attracting capital, one of the things that you've also talked about is the need to, quote, unleash some of our institutions like the Development Finance Corporation, like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, to help spur economic growth and the digital transformation in Latin America. Talk to our learners on the Tech Diplomacy Academy about that. What is the DFC? What is the Millennium Challenge Corporation? And how can those tools be used to spur tech and economic growth in Latin America?
Yeah, and before I do that, just to reemphasize what you said on trust. That is so critical on the point you're making. I really appreciate that you did that, because that is fundamental, and it needs to be emphasized. I mean, look, because of the way that we do things in the U.S. and Western model, which is to say, the private sector is not going to be directed by governments necessarily in terms of where they invest or what they invest in. Sometimes you have to have a little bit of pump priming. Sometimes you have to provide certain incentives or certain things to get the investment to flow. And if there's a market failure in the context of why isn't somebody investing in the infrastructure project here, or the environmental project there, or what have you, sometimes help or assistance from the U.S. government can help along those lines. And that's the delta. That's the market failure oftentimes that we look for institutions like the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, to step in and try to fix. They took over from OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation. But the way that the charter of DFC was drafted by Congress, it actually, in large measure, is prevented from working in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, because it's prevented from working with countries above a certain income threshold. In other words, Latin America is too wealthy for the products to be employed. Now, that's a broad statement. There are ways that it can be done, but the concept that I have is that the Development Finance Corporation, we really need to be focusing less on development and more on strategic investment. And if you change the focus, it changes the way that we deploy these very important tools. It's less of a development institution. Look, we have USAID. We have many development institutions, the Inter-American Foundation, all kinds of development money that goes into emerging markets in Latin America and the Caribbean and elsewhere. And that's important, and that's good work. But, the Development Finance Institution is DFC is supposed to be for strategic investment. And the difference is fundamental, because if we're trying to compete with China, for example, in terms of building infrastructure, roads, ports, bridges, right, that's not necessarily a development or humanitarian issue. That's getting finance to incentivize companies to actually take on those very risky projects in emerging markets. And sometimes they're not going to do that on their own, and they're not necessarily going to get market-based finance to do that. Sometimes they need help from government institutions. So that's one example of how we could deploy our own tools much more effectively in the Western Hemisphere, and why I use the word unleash. Let's take off the shackles. Let's look at Latin America as a strategic investment opportunity. And you put it that way, it totally changes the conversation.
Your lens about it being a strategic investment is so important. Our founder, Keith Krach, when he was Undersecretary of State, and actually many of our colleagues here at the Krach Institute, utilized these tools, these financing tools, very strategically, and I'll say very creatively as well, because there's innovation that's needed in how we utilize these tools and unleash them. When we were working on the Clean Network to secure 5G, as you very well know, in so many of the emerging markets, especially in Latin America, Huawei, China's 5G provider, their national champion and the backbone of their surveillance system, was coming in trying to secure government contracts that are very, very cheap or essentially free. And it's hard for a developing country to say no to that. And so the United States, and working with many of our partners and allies, used some of these tools. We rallied USAID, the Development Finance Corporation, the Export-Import Bank. Our advisory council members, Kim Reed, who's the former president of XM, used all of these tools to essentially put together a package deal and say, we'll help you make up for the cost of going with a trusted vendor versus Huawei. And in fact, it'll allow you to attract even more capital, American investment, government investment, even beyond that. And so I think there's way more opportunity for these tools, as you say, to be fully utilized to drive growth and be strategic investors.
This is exactly the right approach about what you and Keith were doing. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you're competing against a Chinese state-based enterprise like Huawei, I mean, they're going to come in, they're going to underprice the product, and then they're going to give you free of charge, right, maintenance and operations help, so that they'll be running the whole system, and you don't even have to worry about it, right? Well, it sounds great to people who don't have to worry about it, but it's kind of rotten in the context of national security. But the point is that, and I've had this conversation innumerable times with colleagues and investors in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they say, look, we don't have a lot of money. Huawei comes in, they say, we're going to give you this product that you need. We're going to do it for a low price, and it's quality that's sufficient for your purposes. What's not to love? The other product that you're being provided is much more expensive. It costs, more to run. And, why wouldn't we go with that? Well, there are good answers for that. But if you're looking at this through the eyes of a minister of finance in an emerging market who has a limited budget and isn't going to be in office, in another several years, it's a different dynamic. The political incentives are different. So that's where you need a package like what you were describing, Michelle, to put together to make it convenient, not just for the company to invest in that country, but for the country itself to accept that bid and to say, look, this is not apples to apples, it's apples to oranges, and we want the oranges because they're better, right? And we got to get to that point. And that's a very tough obstacle to get beyond. And again, I've had that conversation many, many times. And that's precisely the point about how do you get, greater investor interest in emerging markets when the market conditions themselves aren't on its face as attractive as they could be. That's the market failure that I'm talking about. And it's not necessarily a market failure from a financial or economic perspective even. It's a strategic market failure. Because once you get the backbone of your entire communication system is supplied by the Chinese Communist Party, right, through Huawei or through some other provider, well, that is clearly a different conversation than strictly an economic conversation.
Yes, very prohibitive to attracting additional capital. But, it's a perfect example of tech diplomacy, right? How do you get a government to work together with allied partnered governments in order to spur economic growth, attract private capital, and ultimately result in a trusted technology environment? Speaking of what our adversaries are doing in the region and related to technology, I want to talk about this Chinese port that's being established in Peru. There's been a lot of media attention around it, a lot of attention in the national security community. So this is a $3.5 billion port. It's funded by Chinese bank loans, and it's essentially going to create in Peru the first truly global commercial hub connecting South America on the Pacific coast with China, and allowing them to bypass where the ports stop now in California and in Mexico. So Wall Street Journal did a big piece on this. I know you were quoted in it, and you said that this isn't just a commercial issue, it's a strategic issue. So talk about why that is. Why is this so significant and so strategic to the region?
Yeah, the port of Chancay in Peru, which is just outside of Lima. And we're going to see in the APEC meetings in November, Xi Jinping will come and he'll formally inaugurate the port, and it will be a big deal. And it'll be interesting to see how that compares, for example, with a delegation that the United States might send or other countries might send just to that one meeting. That's a data point, but it's something worth watching. The reason why it changes the strategic balance is because it changes trade patterns fundamentally. And the trade patterns have generally grown over the years. South America, Chinese trade, and there's nothing inherently wrong with countries trading with each other, openly, transparently, anti-corruption, etc. But what this does is it gives China the opportunity really to develop those relationships further in a way that is perhaps done less transparently than what it would be done with Western investment, and frankly less attention to labor rights, the environment, things like this. And it's building out a relationship with China that's long-term, it's sustainable, and it bypasses the West. And so, on its face, is that something that the United States should try to prevent? Well, we don't think we could do so even if we wanted to. But the question is, what's the alternative? Why wasn't the United States the one building that port? Why wasn't the United States building the subway in Bogota, Colombia? Why isn't the United States the one developing the port in Montevideo, Uruguay? Why is it the Chinese? Well, again, it's because of the market failure of investors to look at this in a way that they might look at projects elsewhere around the world. And Chancay is going to make a meaningful difference. It also has the opportunity, to the extent the Chinese utilize it along these lines, to really begin to host visits of Chinese warships and Chinese Navy, People's Liberation Army Navy assets. One of the problems that Peru has faced, and Chile and countries all around the west coast of South America, and increasingly the east coast as well, is illegal fishing by Chinese fleets around the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, and Peruvian fishing has been not decimated, but really impacted by illegal Chinese fishing. Look, it's Chinese have a friendly home port on the coast of Peru. That kind of changes the dynamic and the ability, perhaps, for the Peruvian government to enforce its own fishing limits, its own economic zones. It just changes the political and economic dynamic quite a bit. And then the final thing I would say is this, look, once Chancay is open and really creates a new portal, strategic portal for China into Latin America, what you're going to see, or South America, is you're going to see a lot of the trade moving directly from the interior of South America to the west coast of Peru. Now, from an economic perspective, it's more efficient, perhaps, because normally it goes to the east coast, and then you have to put it through the Panama Canal or around the Horn, and that's inefficient. But we do have the Amazon jungle in the middle, and so in order to get the products from, for example, the very fertile Brazilian agriculture sectors to the west coast of South America, you have to go through some pretty environmentally sensitive areas, such as the Amazon. And this is going to open that up for further development and further challenges from the environmental side, all because you're going to now be seeing product move from the interior to the west coast. And again, from an economic perspective, just in the abstract, that may make sense, but without the types of environmental safeguards that you would routinely see in North America or in Europe or elsewhere, that could be potentially problematic. So there are a lot of different reasons why this is something that I think we should be watching very carefully.
And for our learners and our listeners on the Tech Diplomacy Academy, you might be wondering, why do cargo ships, why does trade, how does that matter when it comes to emerging technology? Well, deepening economic ties like this port would create between Latin America and China mean deepening military ties, trade ties, military ties, information ties, cultural ties, and technology is really at the crossroads of all of that. And so all of this is concerning from a free world perspective. All the more reason we want to make sure that there is collaboration on trusted technology between the U.S. and our allies, especially across Latin America. Eric, for my last question, you work so much with businesses across the United States, across the Americas, in Latin America and Canada, just as much as you do with our government partners. What do you see over the horizon when it comes to the Americas? What is the future for the Americas and emerging technology?
Well, it's a really important question and one that I'm not sure anybody has the answer to, but I think the challenge is going to be for the region to see this, again, as an opportunity that they need to seize. Because the world is moving ahead extraordinarily rapidly. And, other parts of the world, Asia in particular, but also Europe and the United States are just moving ahead by leaps and bounds. Latin America already starts behind in the context of technology investment and development. And so each passing month that this isn't a strategic priority, they fall further and further behind. Look, not every country is going to be able to keep up. Bolivia, for example, is not going to necessarily be the technology hub for the next century. But there are countries, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, absolutely could be. Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, you've already mentioned both those, Panama. These are countries where, there is a strong and vibrant private sector. There is an entrepreneurial spirit. There is capital available. The needs are clearly there. You have educated workforces. We need more, but you have educated workforces. Sometimes what you don't have is the commitment at the government level to create the conditions that are necessary to draw the investment. And, it doesn't help for leaders to be talking against the private sector. It doesn't help for leaders to be, creating political conditions that are, frankly, disruptive or in some cases chaotic. They could be democratically elected, but they have to recognize that there are certain things that are going to scare off, private sector, investors. They have to do more on crime and criminal activity. They have to do more on corruption. There's a whole agenda that is just, there's no surprises. There's no particular insights here. It's something we've been working for years and years. But until governments, in particular, begin to take some of these issues, not just, because, it's good to do, but because their futures depend on it, then I think, we're going to see some additional stagnation. But those countries that do prioritize these, I think, are really going to find that they'll be the recipients of a great deal of investment, and they'll be able to really keep up with some of the others. Again, the opportunities are there. The question is, are we smart enough to work together with our friends and allies and partners to seize them? And I think that's the question. And so to the extent the answer is yes, I would answer your question by saying the future for the region is actually quite bright.
Tremendous opportunity for a very bright future. But to your point, if we're serious about working with like-minded countries, if we're serious about nearshoring and friendshoring, if we're serious about creating a global trusted tech network, then Latin America has to be central to that and is such a critical region, all of the countries' critical partners in the global trusted tech network.
Just real quickly, I would say it has to be beneficial to countries to be a partner with the United States. They have to benefit from it. They have to gain from it. And we have to gain from that partnership too. And sometimes we forget that. It has to be a two-way street. So your point is very well made.
Yeah, such a great point. Eric, thank you very much for lending us your time, your expertise here at the Tech Diplomacy Academy. Thank you to you and to the Council of the Americas for being such a great partner to the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue.
Real pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.